Hey dancers, we work really hard to optimize our bodies for the studio. This is all that we're doing in all of our classes and technique. This is what you do outside of the studio. Every time you stretch or do an abdominal exercise, you're doing something to help your future self as a dancer. We're leaving out one of the biggest components that could assist us to have a long career, enjoy dance, and keep dance in our life for as long as we choose. This is the psychological aspect of dance that gets ignored by most of us. I work with dancers 12 hours a day and can honestly say that every single dancer would benefit from having someone to work through some of the psychological challenges of the dance studio. Whether you realize it or not, the dance world is full of hurdles that only a dancer understands. It's a priority for me to have a network of dance professionals who can help all of you in ways that I can't. When searching out a sports psychologist, I've gone through many of them looking for the right fit for myself and for the dancers that I work with. Now, although there are several sports psychologists that I love and would happily recommend, I'm very excited for you guys to meet Arianna and listen to our conversation as I get candid about some of the mental struggles that I had as a dancer, and we talk about the things that we're seeing in the dance world currently. I asked Arianna the questions that I know my dancers ask me and the ones that I feel like we can all relate to, including that burnout piece and the comparison game. If you're not in the place to listen or absorb this information right now, bookmark this video and listen to it at a later time. I promise that this is information that will resonate as a dancer and artist at some point in your life, and this will be information that you want to have in your pocket.
Hey dancers, so I have Arianna here and I am so excited to have her. She is a sports and performance psychology specialist. Did I say that correctly?
You did.
Good. I am so happy to have you today because I know that the dance world is so much more than what we're doing training our bodies. And I talk a lot about how we work on ourselves from the outside. We've talked a lot about the nutrition that we put in our bodies. But there is a even bigger component that I truly believe is harder to train than the physical aspect of what we're doing. And that is the mental and emotional health of ourselves as we are going through this intense art and sport. And I'm really excited to have you here to shed a little bit of light on some of the things that I know I've experienced and that I hear every single day from my dancers, like having performance anxiety or low confidence, and how do we identify and build those, the comparison game that can happen, burnout, feeling like we don't have control of situations, and what do we do with that information. So there's so much that we go through that I think I didn't realize as a dancer. There was someone who could help me with these aspects that would make training so much easier and better from the physical side. So let me just say that and jump right into having you introduce yourself. Tell everyone a little bit about who you are and what brought you here.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's really wonderful to be here and to speak to something we're both very passionate about, and that's helping dancers become the best versions of themselves, whether that's physically, psychologically, or emotionally, because we know there's such a mind-body connection and we want everything to be working together to help us perform our best. But for everyone who doesn't know me, my name is Arianna Shimits, and as Allie mentioned, I am a sport and performance psychology specialist. So what that means is I help dancers and performing artists and athletes develop psychological skills to help themselves cope with the various obstacles and challenges that kind of come up with elite performance. So you mentioned some of those that are really common. Low self-confidence is one of those, performance anxiety is one of those, burnout's one of those, coming back from injury, and the list kind of goes on and on. And it's a really interesting way of kind of going about it, because as dancers, we think about technique, we think about strength, we think about all those physical things. But if we're not mentally strong or we're not mentally resilient, we're only going to get so far with those physical skills. So it's an important part of training that I think all dancers should start to implement at some level, because we want to be mentally strong. We want to be able to work past those challenges in an adaptive way instead of potentially leaning on some maladaptive behaviors that we often see in dance, unfortunately.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think we've all experienced being in the studio either so much or having such an intense season that maybe it's, you can call it burnout, or I always say I just feel the funk. It's like I just can't be in my body. I don't want to be in the studio. I don't want to be out of the studio. I don't know what I need, but I know that what I'm feeling is not good or productive for me to be in the studio and cranking out the best that I can for whatever performance or whatever the artistic director is asking of. Um, you were a dancer. You firsthand experience with this. Are some of those aspects things that you experienced that made you want to step into this field?
Yeah, so really great question. Absolutely. I was fortunate to have a professional career in classical ballet and then also spent the majority of my childhood as a pre-professional training student. So I have firsthand experience of
You
those
know,
stressors and obstacles. And absolutely, I think that's something that I lean on heavily when I'm working with my clients because, yes, I have the education and I know the theories and interventions on more of the educational side and more of the intervention side. But having those experiences is important too because I've lived through it and I know how difficult it can be to work past some of those psychological challenges in a studio setting. So, I mean, as you mentioned, I think that's really important with our work with dancers, kind of connecting our own experience so they realize they're not alone because this is such a common topic that we're talking about.
did, gosh, I always go back and forth with this because when parents talk to me, they talk about the group aspect of dance, especially young kids, because a lot of people are on competition teams now, and they do have these kind of team building experiences where they're working so intensely together. They are workshopping, they're traveling, they're having these highs and these lows emotionally as a young kid or a, like a adolescent. Uh, and then at the same time, this is not really a team sport. This is
No.
absolutely an individual endeavor that
Mhm.
we mush into one. And that competition that can happen because of that mentality or because of what ballet is or dance is very intense. And there's also there's things that happen with the way we teach or the way our classes are laid out that
Yeah.
I don't think everyone realizes until later on in life how much comparison can be happening in that studio setting and how much of it sticks with us as dancers. I'm sure that you can have, I'm sure you have many stories, I do too, of things that I didn't realize were maybe mentally unhealthy, and maybe you have a better word for that, but
Mhm.
until I stepped out of the dance world, until I ended my career and had been out of it a little bit and came back and was like, why are we doing things this way? Why? And I realized, oh my gosh, I did that. That's exactly how I would have handled the situation. But
Mhm.
the dance world is so compact and on top of each other, and this weird mix of personal, individual sport and working together, corps de ballet, groups, competitions, whatever it is. Do you have any insight on that aspect of it and what you see with your dancers or yourself?
Sure. Yeah, so I think, you bring up a really interesting concept in that absolutely if an audience member was to look at a corps de ballet, they think teamwork, right? And
Yeah.
there are aspects of teamwork. You do have to work well together. You have to be very aware of the people you're performing with, but it is really an individual sport or an individual performance domain because of that competitive nature or that comparison that really happens throughout a dancer's career. And I think, it's challenging to remove comparison from dance, right? I mean, we
Mhm.
have a thing that's called a mirror in front of us most of the day. We're wearing a leotard and tights. You're constantly looking at other people to improve or to push yourself further. And then with this generation, we also have social media, which can be pretty toxic for, self-comparison and self-esteem. So, I think when we think of comparison, we always think, oh, that's such a bad thing, but it doesn't necessarily need to be. We can learn a lot from comparison, right? If we're comparing ourselves to someone else in a really adaptive way, we might be able to look at the things that they're doing and take that into our own practice in a way that feels good for us. But what we often see in a dance setting is we look at someone else and, it makes us feel poorly about ourselves, or like we're not good enough, or we don't have the right body type. So I think there's a lot of work that can be done in almost reframing that comparison. We know what's going to happen. We can't get rid of it, but how can we use it in a healthier way?
Yeah. Is there something that springs to mind that you tell dancers a lot to start making that switch with? Because I'm even thinking, I know there's mantras and there's things that I can kind of say to myself, or I've done sticky notes and it works for me, but it's hard. It's hard to make that switch in my brain and keep it consistent. And I think I hear from dancers a lot that they don't know where to start when switching the monologue inside of their head of, like you're saying, comparison is a good thing. It could be a good and a bad thing. So how do we make that little switch, or how do I start to identify that to make the switch?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of different strategies for this, and a couple of them you mentioned, right? Using positive affirmations could be helpful, using sticky notes, or I even had a dancer who I'd have move like a hair tie from one wrist to the other, just to acknowledge which comparison was going on. So using like a physical marker. But I would say the most important thing that we need to develop is awareness that it's happening. I think when I'm working with dancers, sometimes they'll come into session and say, today's class was really horrible, or, rehearsal was really horrible. And they're not able to realize that they were feeling poorly about themselves because of comparison. So it kind of goes back to that awareness piece. And in the moment, being able to say, oh, I just compared myself to that person. Because what that awareness does is it kind of stops us in our tracks. And it makes us realize how often we're doing that. But I think the really thing that we need to be really careful about is labeling it. If we're in class and we're saying, oh, that was comparison, and we're really negative about it, oh, I engaged in comparison again. I'm not doing a good job at being positive, right? I'm really being bad at being positive. And it's kind of this negative spiral. So what I try to, encourage dancers to do is to have that awareness, but then to not judge it, So being able to say, okay, I just engaged in comparison, and that's okay, right? We're not saying it's a bad thing. We're just acknowledging that it's happening. And then maybe a couple months down the line, once they're really self-aware and they're able to kind of call themselves out, maybe then we try a strategy. But trying to have awareness and try a strategy at the same time is kind of a tall order. So I think really breaking it down and making sure that we're aware without judgment.
Yeah, I love that. One of the things that you told me earlier when we were speaking that really stood out to me was you were saying that part of your job is helping dancers or athletes identify individual development and execution of mental, emotional, and knowledge and skills. I wrote it down because I thought it was so good. But identifying, that seems like the first thing for any change that we want to make in our mental state. Also in our physical, we think about it, you get a correction, you're sickling your foot. Well, I didn't know I was sickling my foot. So now I can make a change because it's been identified. And that same thing is happening mentally. And I guess as you're saying, and I compare it to that physical correction, I know that we can beat up on ourselves when we hear, oh, my foot was sickled. Oh no. But really it's just, your teacher is there to identify when things are happening so that you can make a change and work on the steps to keep that change consistent. And I can see that would be the same as we come to our mental state. We start by identifying, and we have someone who can assist us to identify that, because I didn't know I was sickling. I didn't know I was fill in the blank when it comes to my mental state.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And, in some ways, finding those things physically can be a little bit easier because we can look in a mirror, or we can, do a strength test and figure out where our weaknesses are. But for more psychological challenges, that's a really tall order, or a big task to do by yourself. So absolutely, that's a lot of what I do with athletes and performers, is just trying to find, okay, here are some of those strengths and how we can apply some of those strengths to your weaknesses. But it really all comes back to that self-awareness piece, and being able to really look into our inner experience and say, this is what's happening, and I'm going to give a word for it, or I'm going to label it so I know how to move forward.
I can really see, I'm just thinking of dancers I'm working with right now. I can really see how the comparison game can ripple into what we would call low confidence. And at this time of year, when we're recording this, it's Nutcracker season, and auditions have happened. And that's always a kick in the pants in any direction, getting the role you want, the role you didn't think you were going to get. Why did I get this many shows? Why did that person get that? And that tends to be a spiral that happens for dancers when we have that audition season into Nutcracker. And then it ripples into, we have auditions, and then we have competition, and then we're back into auditions and summer programs. And I can just see how that, why did this happen, comparison game keeps spiraling into a dancer that then doesn't have enough confidence to show the skill set they have acquired and that they're beautiful at.
Right. Yeah, and it's very similar to a physical injury when you think about it, right? If you twist an ankle and you keep dancing on it, all of a sudden it's going to become something more, right? And it's going to become a bigger injury. And the same thing happens with our psychological health, right? If all of a sudden something really we take a hit to our self-confidence and we don't do anything about it, it's just kind of that downward spiral. So it's really similar in a lot of ways, that we have to be aware so we can, take those preventative measures, or be able to intervene when that confidence first takes a hit, instead of 6 months down the line.
Yeah. I 1000% wish I had realized that this would be a major part of a healthy dance life. Also just normal human life. I see more and more, and it kind of hurts my heart more and more, actually, to see how much our dancing mentality, and I'm going to say the negative sides of dance, because I think there's a lot of positives, but there are quite a few negatives still that exist in the dance world, and that we absorb as dancers. And it totally 1000% translates into my other relationships, not only with myself, but with loved ones, and the way I communicate in the world, and the way I talk to myself. And I kind of think for myself, if I had known that in 20 years, what I'm thinking right now will affect my future that much, I think I might have taken it more seriously, because in my generation of dancing, it was very much no pain, no gain. That is still a thing. It's absolutely still a thing, but it was really heavy. And it was just like, well, you just got to deal with it. It's the way it is. If you haven't experienced this, you're not a real dancer. And if you can't stuff it, then how are you going to make it in the dance world? And that's led to a lot of mentally unhealthy dancers of my generation and generations before. And I hear so often that dancers my age don't want their kids to be in ballet.
Right.
And I would be one of them. And I think that's a very fascinating topic, especially since I'm still in the dance world. But I would not want, at this point, I would not want my child to be in the dance world. And that hurts. That sucks. There is something wrong. So I say all that because I really hope that younger dancers, or dancers later in life who are realizing that there are things that we could be working on, this is such a huge part of building for the rest of our lives, as well as being on the stage and successful in college or in dance programs or in your artistic career later on.
Yeah, I think you highlighted something really important, and that is Psychological skills are life skills. They're not just performance skills, right? Whether you are a dancer or you're a student or you're an employee, being able to cope with stress effectively is going to be helpful for you. Knowing how you understand things or how you process thoughts and emotions is never going to be a bad thing. It's always going to help you have one leg up. And, I really resonated with what you said about our generation, in that you had to suffer to make it. That was kind of the thought process, right? And that really is something I hope to challenge in my work. And I know that's something you hope to challenge in your work as well, is that we just need better tools. We don't necessarily need to suffer. We just need to be stronger, and we need to be more flexible and be able to adapt better. So I really hope that that does happen. And I think having conversations about our mental performance and mental health are so important because it helps us get there. And, I think a lot of people have a similar thought in, it'd be hard to put your own child in dance because there are a lot of protective factors, but there are also a lot of challenges. And again, that's something I really hope we see change in the next generation.
Yeah, me too. And, I think our mental health ties so closely to your ability to recover physically. I mean, if you've ever been injured and you have the moment, the day, the weeks or months where it just feels like, I don't know how I'm going to get back in the studio. I don't know if I want to. And it can escalate even deeper than that. If you don't get yourself out of that state, you're not going back into the studio. And plenty of dancers don't. Their injuries could heal or do heal physically, but they don't have the mental or emotional stability or oomph to get back into it. And I think that more often than not, it's not the physical injury that takes a dancer out of the studio, whether that's just recreationally or in a career, but it's the mental ability to come back from that. I know that is 1000% me. When I tore the labrum in my hip, yes, it took me a couple years to figure out how to take care of it. But once I did, I could move without pain. I could have gone back into dance. And I said, no, I can't mentally get back into this. I can't mentally rehab myself back into the studio. And I said almost exactly those words. And I remember saying them to my parents and to my loved ones, and they got it, but it was like, wait, what? This is the thing that you've loved and trained for, and you could do this again, or you could try to. And I didn't have the mental and I see that so often with dancers at all the different varying skills.
Yeah, and I mean, the fear of re-injury is something that came to mind as you were speaking. And there are so many different things. And, at the end of the day, it doesn't make us weak to reach out for resources. It just means that we're working smart,
Yeah.
We realize that we need help, or even that, yeah, we could do it by ourselves, but it'll be slightly easier if we ask for help along the way. So absolutely, I do see a lot of dancers step away for injury or for, transitions in their life. And I always wonder about that too. If they were to have some type of psychological support, would they be able to step back onto stage, or would they be able to develop a different relationship with dance? Maybe not as a professional, but as an adult dancer or a recreational dancer. So I think you bring up a really good point in that we do need emotional support. We do need psychological support just as much as we need physical support.
And that in that setting of the mental getting back into it, that feeling of fatigue, I'm just like going through my own what am I trying to say? I'm recalling my own mental state when I was in that. And then honestly, I probably get a dancer a day that's going through something like this every single day. This mental weight that I felt, I'll call it a weight, leads to so much burnout. And that burnout leads to injury. It trickles into things. And I'm sure that dancers come to you with the expressing that they just feel burnt out. Is that something that happens a lot? Am I imagining that?
No, you're pretty accurate in that assumption, especially during COVID, right? Where motivation was kind of down and people are really not in control of their situations anymore. And there was a lack of autonomy. Burnout was a really big conversation. And I think it's common in dance because you don't have a lot in your control, especially in a pre-professional or professional setting, right? You're kind of given a schedule. You're given casting, you're required and persuaded to do a lot of different things, and that can be really burdensome, especially when you feel like you need a break or you feel like you need a mental health day. So I would absolutely say that burnout is a big topic, and that manifests in a lot of different ways. For some people, that means a lack of motivation. For some people, that means injury because they're not able to stay focused in class and rehearsal, and their mind's somewhere else, and injury is more prone to happen when that happens as well. People become really irritable or might even isolate from their family and friends and support systems because they're not feeling happy in their situation. So, I mean, burnout can look like a lot of different things, and it's often trying to help someone reignite that motivation and reignite their goals and their values for themselves to move forward. But yeah, that is a really common topic and something that I experienced as well as a dancer, especially after something like a long Nutcracker season when you've done the same performance so many times and you're feeling kind of bored or tired or not really in control of your situation.
Yeah. And as you were saying during like pandemic times, the burnout was real. All of us could, I think, pretty across the board say we experienced that at some point. But now with that, maybe that burnout, that dip, and then coming back into the studio where I see dancers going full bore. Doesn't matter if they are young, if they are adults, if they're professionals. It is like pedal to the metal 10 times, making up for the past. I know so many dancers this summer who did 2 or 3 summer intensives because they hadn't been able to do them for 2 years before, trying to make up for lost time, whatever it is. They're ramping up so much that injuries are high, but I also think that the mental, I'll use the word injury since I said for physical too. I also think that the mental injury is high, coming from maybe that down swoop into the up, and then the little crash that can happen after.
Yeah.
What I'm sure you experienced that working with athletes in the last year or so. Do you have any feelings or insights for dancers who are kind of at that tip at the top? We're at Nutcracker, we're doing all the things you have been pushing since COVID, you making up for lost time, whatever it is that's happening, you're up here and probably headed for a little down swoop that we can see coming over the edge here. Do you have any thoughts or advice for them?
Yeah, that's a really good point and something I definitely observed as well. I would say something that's important to think about is working smart, not working hard. And developing a different relationship with rest. I think a lot of athletes and performers feel guilty about resting, but we need to think about rest as being really productive because rest allows us to push forward. And if we're not resting both physically and mentally, we're not going to be able to push ourselves. And, something that I find kind of interesting working with athletes and performers is that people will say, well, I engaged in self-care, I mentally rested. And I always have to ask them about what that self-care looks like, right? If your self-care is, say, taking a bath, but that whole time you were in the bath, you were having anxiety about a performance, that's no longer self-care, right? We're not really resting psychologically. So I think it's about becoming really smart in how we engage in self-care, how we engage in rest, and really developing smart work and not harder work, because harder work just leads to burnout.
Yeah, I always say that more is not always better. Sometimes it's just more. Always.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's just more, and I think it should be most of the time it's just more.
Right.
I also thought, as you were saying, you're sitting in that bathtub and you're like, I'm taking me time, but your brain is still in it times 20. that is a big warning sign for me when I'm headed towards burnout and feeling stressed, is when I can't just sit and be without my mind in somewhere else. Doesn't always feel stressful, whereas what I would label as stressful. But I have come to realize that if I'm going to bed and my mind is still on the day or on what's happening tomorrow or the month later, or I'm thinking about certain dancers or clients, whatever it is, family, for me, that's a big warning sign that I got to start making a change, because my mind can't be quiet, and it needs that quiet. It really does. And so it doesn't matter how much time I'm taking if I can't quiet my mind.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And yeah, I guess that would be my advice, is just to really think about your self-care. Is it actually self-care, or are we just kind of going through the physical motions? Because if we're just going through the physical motions, we're probably not getting as much benefit out of it as we should be.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, for yourself, when you are working with athletes and performers, I know some of the people who follow along with me are also gymnasts or skaters. I work with a couple ice skaters, but all kind of along that artistic, high drive, high performance level and skill here. If any of them are noticing that they have some of these little mental tics that we're like, oh yeah, that I checked that box. Oh, I checked that box too. What are ways for them to reach out to you? What are things that you offer, and how can they start their journey towards a little bit more recognition of what's happening mentally for them?
Yeah, great question. So absolutely feel free to reach out to me. You can reach me at persistentpsych.com. There's an option to click on my name and bio and shoot me an email. I do a lot of consultation with dancers. Sometimes that's just 15 minutes to get to know each other and see if, there's something that you're struggling with that I can help you with. And then we kind of go from there. Sometimes individual work can be 2 years long, right? Meeting weekly. And then for other people, it's just meeting 5 times, and they feel like they can utilize some of those skills and put them in their, what we call, psychological toolkit to take with them as they progress into their career or into their life. So it really just kind of depends. Other things that we try to do on a regular basis are write blog posts or engage in conversations like this. And if that's helpful for you, you can give us a follow on Instagram too, at Persistent Psych. And we generally put up some psychoeducation materials out there. And this was a really wonderful conversation, and I'm looking forward to hearing from some of your listeners.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I love and hate social media, which everyone knows if they follow along. But one thing that I've been doing over the last couple of years, probably since COVID kind of hit our life, is I started thinking more about how I was curating my social media. I as a creator, am always thinking about that, and like, what am I giving? What am I putting out there? But social media you have no control over. When you open it, you don't know what is going to pop onto that screen. And it can be something that brings you joy. It can be something that you're like, I wasn't ready for. This is not what I wanted to see today. It could be something positive, but not in your scope. So curating my content for that I'm taking in has been huge. So as you said, if this type of video or having social media is part of your life, I can't recommend more that use as a user, as a dancer, start really thinking about if I open my screen, what do I want to see, and what is going to help me be a better dancer. We follow a lot of accounts that are inspirational.
Right. Yeah.
May not be that inspiring for you. For someone else, yes. But if you find yourself going, oh, I wish I could do that, or that negative self-talk starts, or you start realizing you're in that comparison game, I would recommend starting to hide those people. You don't have to delete them, but start filling with people like you that are posting things that will inspire you or ask a question of you. that make you a better dancer in a way, besides just visually taking in something that looks inspiring. There's a place for that, but social media can be so bombarding. And if I'm going to be bombarded, I want it to be something that's going to help me be better at what I'm trying to do.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think you made a good point about using it to feel inspired and just being really, honest with yourself if that is inspiring to you or it's really pushing you down. I think that's a really important part of it, and making sure, yeah, you are following those accounts that lift you up and make you feel like the best version of yourself can be a really helpful way to become more of an educated consumer.
And there is a season for everything. I've really noticed that with social media content that I take in. There's people who I have found so inspiring and have helped me through different times of life. And currently there is just something that doesn't inspire me. And it doesn't mean that they're not wonderful people or creating great content. It's just not, it is not hitting me at this moment in time. So I just choose to hide those, and I come back to it later in life when it feels like the right time and place. So curate your social media.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much for coming on and giving these wonderful tips. This has been very helpful. I hope that everyone takes advantage of what you have to offer on your social media. And honestly, I really can't speak enough to taking care of your mental health. It will drive your physical health. It will help you through injuries. It will give you the drive to keep going in whatever your goals are. It doesn't even have to be dance, but keeping that as kind of the forefront of your thought will do so much for all the goals that you have as a dancer. So keep this in mind. And as always, if you have any questions for me, I'm happy to send you wherever you need to go and to assist you to find the right people. And Arianna is definitely one of them. So thank you so much for coming on. This was a wonderful morning for me. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It was a joy to be here.